Today we are studying Matthew chapter 17, 14 through 21. Verse 14. When they came to the crowd, a man approached Jesus and knelt before him. Matthew, Mark, and Luke put this miracle right after coming down the mountain of transfiguration. Matthew's account is much shorter than Mark's, which has led some scholars to believe that Matthew used independent information here. So after a glorious meeting on the mountain, it's followed by a valley of corrupt and godless people arguing over a boy. As a crowd met Jesus, a man cried out to him, requesting that the Lord take a look at his son. Mark and Luke have the Father calling Jesus teacher. Only Matthew has the Father calling Jesus Lord, or Kurios. In Mark and Luke, the Father does not kneel. Only Matthew says the Father knelt. The Greek word for kneeling here is gonupeteo. It does not necessarily mean worship, but rather it's suggesting humility. The Father and his Son perhaps gathered with the crowd in anticipation. His purpose is to find an answer for his son. The man brought his son to the right place and to the right person. I wonder from where they came from, and how far did they have to travel to meet Jesus? Was the man an Israelite? Or was he a foreigner? Was he from the northern Israel? Or did he come all the way from Judah? The man obviously heard of Jesus' fame and his disciples, and he tried everything else available. He had seen the general practitioners, he had taken his son to the local psychiatrist, renowned experts. They had, prescribed their sedatives, their seizure meds, so to speak, their, Lyrica and Prozac, but nothing worked because the problem was a spiritual one. Finally, when all the other options had been exhausted, the man brought this boy to Jesus. We cannot fault the man for that, but he may not have realized that he needed Jesus as much as his son. Verse 15, Lord, have mercy on my son, he said. He has seizures and is suffering greatly. He often falls into the fire or into the water. Now, another commendable thing which we see in this man is his plea. It may not have been as respectful as it should have been. It may not have been sufficiently humble, but we have to remember the spiritual condition of the man himself in this story, not just the sons. So this father has still a lot to learn about Jesus. He probably doesn't know that he is the Son of God. He's not just another rabbi. Now, notice the word mercy here. It's the Greek word elio. To show mercy, as God defines it, is to show compassion. So the person asking for mercy recognizes that the other person has authority and power, which to their time only kings demonstrate mercy. Now the Greek word for seizure is seleniazomai. So this name is from the ancient Greek goddess Selene, meaning Titan of the moon. It's connected to the word silas, meaning brightness or brightness of the full moon. So in Greek mythology, Selene was a lunar deity. Her equivalent in ancient Roman religion and myth is Luna, or the Latin for moon, where we get the English word moonstruck. And Eleo's mercy, she was a goddess. So remember, when the New Testament writers are writing certain words, it could be an attack to these, Greek gods and goddesses. And the people hearing it know this, because that's the first thought in their mind. And so here, lunatic is found twice in the Bible, here and in Matthew 4:24, where it says Jesus' fame went throughout all of Syria, And they brought unto him all sick people that were taken with diverse diseases and torments, and those which were possessed with devils, and those which were lunatic, and those that had the palsy, and he healed them. So notice that the verse I just read differentiates between demon-possessed people and lunatics. It may be that some people with mental illness are just that, sick. But at the same time, it's more than possible that many such people are demon-possessed. They are not called lunatics, rather, they're as being described as lunatic. So, what is a seizure? Well, a seizure happens when there's an abnormal electrical discharge in your brain. A single seizure doesn't mean you have epilepsy. So the next question is, what is epilepsy? Well, it is defined as having, chronic seizures. Sometimes, they can vary, including, temporary confusion, loss of consciousness or awareness, and, psychic symptoms. And so the description of the illness is more detailed in the other Gospels. It describes literally the boy's symptoms. Mark speaks of foaming at the mouth, the grinding of teeth, a rigid body, not being able to speak. That's in Mark chapter 9, 17 through 18. Mark provides an accurate picture of idiopathic epilepsy. Idiopathic means non-traceable disease. Now, Luke mentions his crying out, his convulsions, bruises, and foaming at the mouth. Luke 9:39. And Luke used a medical term used by the father, as we know, the father of medicine, Hippocrates. He's back to 460 BC, and he used this Greek word sparazo for convulsions. So these symptoms, lead most to see epilepsy, or at least a type of disorder that looks like epilepsy. But it was not just a physical problem, because epilepsy itself does not cause suicidal tendencies. The boy's illness was a spiritual one. And so, verse 16, I brought him to your disciples, but they could not heal him. So who did he bring the boy to? Well, probably 9 of the disciples, while Jesus was with the other 3 up on the mountain. Sometimes Jesus' followers fail, but we know Jesus never does. So the man was wise for going straight to Jesus when his followers failed. And so, verse 17, you unbelieving and perverse generation, Jesus replied, how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy here to me. Because of the failure of the disciples, notice the tone of Jesus' words. We can sense his frustration and, exasperation. He rebuked the audience by calling them a faithless and perverse generation. The reference to a perverse generation has Old Testament roots. It is applied to the Israelites in the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32. Moses said to them that they were a perverse and unbelieving generation. They saw the works of God and still did not believe. Therefore, God was deeply disappointed with them. So these were the Israelites in the time of Moses. They were God's children, but they were no longer his children, as they were faithless and perverse. And in Matthew 17:17, we literally find these same words which were applied to Israel to the disciples. So Jesus rebuked the whole Jewish people as a whole probably here, but his words were also intended for the disciples. And when they heard Jesus say this, they probably linked it back to Deuteronomy. Now notice those words, how long shall I be with you? The point of the statement is basically this. You are depending on me to do these things, to break the power of the evil one, to cast out this demon. What will happen when I'm not here anymore? I'm about to depart, he kept telling them. I'm going to the cross. Soon I will not be with you. How are you going to work for the salvation of the world? How are you going to deliver mankind from the power of evil and the power of sin? What you need is power. You have to know how to handle spiritual power. In verse 18, Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of the boy, and he was healed at that moment. So it is obvious in this passage that the boy who was brought to Jesus and said to be seleniazomai, or lunatic, was in reality demon possessed. Matthew now uses the word daimonizomai. So Matthew clearly demonstrates here that the seizure and demon attacks are not one and the same. Seizures are a physical disorder, and demonize finds its source in demons. Now, just to clarify, we cannot be possessed by demons, but we can be attacked by demons. But we normally use the word possess because that's the traditional word. And so Matthew here is telling us that, or Matthew does not try to correct the mistake by using the word daimonizomai. Matthew is simply quoting the boy's father who uses the word seleniazomai. So the boy's father did not understand the difference between a seizure or a demon, but Jesus certainly did. Now here, for the Greeks like Socrates, the idea of demons, as you can see here in the left side, is where it says is a mighty demon. According to Carl Jung, he's quoting Diotima. And so they believe that demons were actually, as Socrates has here, a divine signal or a human conscience, something inside of them that's guiding them. Not necessarily evil, but something good. I mean, that's how they viewed this Greek word, demon or daimon. And so something else, compounded the son's tragic situation. Previous efforts to cast out the spirit, had failed. Having heard of Jesus to be at that time a successful exorcist, the father had to come to Jesus, hoping for a cure for his son. But Jesus was nowhere to be found. He then went to the disciples. This was an appropriate decision since the disciples had been entrusted with a certain measure of power to cast out demons. Children need parents to bring them to Jesus. But how did this child end up with an evil spirit? What happens in a little boy's life to leave him demonized? Like, what was he exposed to? So who did sin that this child became, demon possessed or controlled? Apparently it was not the child himself, because all this began so early in his life. But this possession could have been the parents' fault. Perhaps for a while the parents were dabbling in the occult in some way. That's why at the beginning we ask, is the father an Israelite? Because if he's an Israelite, they're not going to be looking at the occult, right? If he's a foreigner, well, obviously they're looking at the occult. Like here, these gods where daimon used to mean, knowledge, not what we now know as demon. So that's why they say there's some knowledge inside of you. They may have opened the family door, to demon possession. Sometimes the words witchcraft and sorcery are found in the Bible, and it's translated in the Greek as pharmacia, where we get our word pharmaceutical. Then again, when it comes to the unredeemed, there's really nothing to keep a demon from taking control of that person. Verse 19, then the disciples came to Jesus in private and asked, why couldn't we drive it out? Well, why do you suppose that they did try to help? Did they command the demon in the name of Jesus to depart? Did they lay hands upon the boy? Did they pray over him? Or perhaps they had been successful, in other times, and now they become complacent. They were going through the religious motions, ritual motions, because they'd done it so many times before, right? They had, in other words, they had gone to church, they had sung the selected hymns, they bowed in prayer when they were told, right? Kind of like we do at church when we go every Sunday. And probably their hearts were not properly engaged in it anymore. It's just a routine. They may have been trying to cast out this demon in the strength of their, you know, oratory skills, their fancy words. They were disconnected really from the source of power that they needed. Verse 20. He replied, "Because you have so little faith, truly I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you." So little faith in Greek, and you've seen this word probably in other presentations, is oligopistia. It's a little more faith than they had, you know, to move mountains, so to speak, meaning overcoming difficulties. The mountain here is in reference to the Mount of Transfiguration, perhaps, in the shadow in which they are still standing. Our trouble is always with this mountain, which confronts our path. It's an obstacle. The disciples did have some faith since they had been successful in the past and, in exorcism or healing, but now they're surprised by their failure. They thought they had faith, yet their faith was poor and ineffectual. I mean, it produced the same effect as no faith. In that sense, it may be said that they were faithless. Now, some translations read faith the size of a mustard seed, but the word size or its equivalent is not in the Greek. Jesus simply says faith as a mustard seed. That's it. A seed does nothing until, obviously, it is planted. After that, it can overcome obstacles and even move rocks through its continuous expansion and growth. Seeds are persistent, and they never give up, as little as they are. Where there is faith, there is a way. It isn't because of the quantity of our faith, but the object of our faith. Because you can have a lot of faith, but your faith is not looking at the right object, which is Jesus. Sometimes people have faith in faith itself. If our faith is in God and Jesus Christ, then it has a great effect. Now, first, it's critical to note Jesus is using an illustration here. Jesus may not literally be talking about a mountain, moving mountains and uprooting trees. There's no example in Scripture of mountains disappearing because someone had faith. Jesus is teaching that, stunning things happen if we have faith. Now, I'm going to read this part here. But it is important to understand the context of this verse. 8 miles to the south of Jerusalem, outside of Bethlehem, was the Herodian, the mountain we just saw in the previous slide. The Herodian was a fortress built by King Herod. To build this fortress, Herod literally moved a mountain. Through slave labor, he took 2 small hills and converted them into one great mountain. It is possible that when Jesus, talked about moving the mountains, that his original hearers had the Herodian in mind. It might have seemed impossible, but they had seen with their own eyes that it was not impossible to move mountains. It was a monumental task, but not impossible. It involved many years of harsh labor, and it was not accomplished in a day, in a month, or even a year. And that's How to Move a Mountain, November 17, 2015, by Phil Resler. And so, Jesus, talking about moving a mountain, like this article says, the people hearing him They knew what Herod did. He took hills through slave labor. But the point here is the persistence. See, Herod was persistent in building this mountain by taking the dirt from other smaller mountains or hills to produce one big mountain. In other words, if Herod can move mountains and does not have faith, then if you have faith in the right object, which is Jesus, then you can move spiritual mountains. And so this account is not really a healing story as much as it is a story instructing, disciples in ability and in power. If you look at this passage carefully, you can see that the word unable is a key word. It is used 3 times. And so another thing that stands out from these words is that the Lord expected the disciples to be able to deal with the case. I mean, there's no point rebuking the disciples if they were not expected to do it in the first place. They should have been able to heal the boy, but they could not. There was nothing more frustrating to Jesus than having taught his disciples all this time. He saw that they were still spiritually weak. They were now coming to the end of their period of training. Jesus was about to be offered up for the sins of the world, and they still lacked faith. Now, verse 16, I put verse 16, 19, and 20 here. Verse 16, they could not, uk edi nethesen, they could not cure him. Verse 19, why could we not, uk edi nethemen, cast it out? Verse 20, nothing will be impossible, uden edi natesai, for you. And the root word used in these 3 places is the word dunamis, where we get the word dynamite, which means power. So this is a story that has to do with power. Now, there is a contrast between Jesus' power to heal and the disciples' lack to heal. But the miraculous healing itself takes second place. Jesus' exorcism is described with minimal detail in one single verse, verse 18. All the emphasis falls on the disciples' inability to heal the boy, on their lack of what? Power. And what this reveals about their spiritual condition: a desperate father and a frustrated savior, embarrassed disciples and a patient teacher. When you are desperate, run to Jesus. That's the answer. Verse 21. But depending on your Bible version, there is no verse 21. So Matthew 17:21 is not found in the Greek text of either Sinaiticus or Vaticanus. These 2 are oldest New Testament manuscripts. It seems to have been, this verse may have been incorporated by very early copyists, and they took it from Mark 9:29. And so if you've never studied textual criticism, you could look into that, because sometimes you hear people say, well, I don't like to use the NIV because they take things out of it. It's not that they took things out of it, it's that it wasn't there to begin with. And so here you can see at the very top on the left, this is Stephen's 1550 Textus Receptus. And it has the whole verse 21, and it underlined is proskuneo kai, right? Instii, with fasting and prayer. And so you can see under those 3, they're the same. You have the 1550 on the left side, 1894, and the Byzantine majority. They all have that verse. But notice the yellow arrow. Alexandrian text does not have it. The Hort and Westcott, they're 2 Cambridge scholars, Greek experts. They don't have it in their version either. The Latin Vulgate has it. King James Version has it. The American Standard Version has it, but notice Bible in Basic English, it's not there. All the other Bibles seem to have that verse. Now here I have Strong's Parallel. The Berean Study Bible doesn't have it. All the other Bibles have it. Young's, Holman, New American, King James. The New International Version doesn't have it. The New Living Translation, English Standard Version, doesn't have it. At the bottom, the Net Bible doesn't have it. Why? Well, this is why. Our oldest sources, as we said, is Sinaiticus. Over here on the left side, Codex Sinaiticus. Notice the dates. They're 4th century. And some of them even go back perhaps to the 3rd century. So the original scribe skips straight from verse 20 to 22. A later corrector squeezes the verse in the margin. Proof even 7th century scribes knew something was off. Codex Vaticanus, 325 AD, it's pristine. No verse, no correction, no space left for it. And so on the right side, why Matthew 17:21 disappeared and why it's not a conspiracy, right? So ancient sources on the side of include the verse. So the entire Byzantine manuscript tradition, roughly from the 5th century onward, thousands of copies, they have it. So this has to do with what's called the Alexandrian text and the Byzantine text. So notice here on the left, Byzantine, there's about 5,000 manuscripts or portions. The Alexandrian text, about 200 manuscripts or fragments. Now the Byzantine's earliest date, 4th century, plus earlier readings extant. The Alexandrian earliest date, 2nd century. Now we move further down, the Byzantine, close to the location where New Testament was written. The Alexandrian manuscripts, close to the date when the New Testament was written. All the Byzantine text says agreement among texts is the norm. The Alexandrian textual variants do not agree with each other. Now, I would have a problem if all 4 Gospels said exactly the same thing. Then we don't need 4 Gospels, we would just need 1. But when we have textual variants, like the Alexandrian text, that's better because then you can compare. This is not about comparing Matthew with Luke, where people say it contradicts itself. They don't contradict themselves. Each writer is writing his perspective. It's like if there's an accident and you have 5 witnesses, each one's going to give you a different detail about the same accident. We're here talking about the same manuscript, a Matthew manuscript, Byzantine Matthew manuscript versus an Alexandrian Matthew manuscript. And there's differences. So in this image here on the right, the Byzantine text is being copied. That's why it says there's more than 5,000. Because this is a late manuscript dealing here. We know which one's late because they're usually in minuscule, or we call them, small letter. And the older ones are all caps. And the all caps ones are Alexandrian texts. Those are older. So that's why in this image here, you see more Byzantine being, copied versus Alexandrian at the bottom. There was less. That's why it says 200 manuscripts versus 5,000 manuscripts from the Byzantine era. Now, obviously, we're not going to go into all this right now, but just to give you a quick historical reason as to why Matthew 17:21 is not in most Bibles. Now, some Bibles, they do follow the Alexandrian text, and they'll include it in their Bible, but they may have a little note that says it is not in the earliest manuscripts. But they chose to leave it in the text because people were used to it. Okay, so you'll find a lot of that in the Bible. There's other stories too that are not in the Alexandrian text, but they are in the Byzantine text. Now, the Alexandrian texts are our earliest manuscripts. The Byzantine is late manuscripts. We're talking from as far as 10th century all the way to the 15th century. So, what could be the application? Your little faith in Jesus can grow to see beyond the mountain. Please subscribe. Please share. Thank you, and God bless you.